Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at Akkerman Diep-duinwaterblauw. I'll be doing a writing sample with a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll be writing on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'll also take a look at some writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare Diep-duinwaterblauw to other blue-black inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. The writing sample that I did with my glass dip pen was very crisp and the lines were nice and uniform. The swatch that I did with my tweezers was nice and crisp and fairly uniform on this Tomoe River paper, but on other types of paper I had trouble with the ink holding on to the paper. The drip at the end of the swatch is pretty dark, but if you look closely you can see that there's a slight halo of sheen. The first writing sample will be with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. On the other papers that I did writing samples on, this extra fine nib was nice enough. It was okay. But on this Tomoe River paper, it is very pleasant. I'm going to go ahead and describe it as smooth, especially for this fine of a nib. Nice and crisp and very legible. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Custom 74. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This Pilot Fine nib is nice and smooth, and this ink seems pretty flowy. I'm seeing a significantly wider line in this fine nib, and like I mentioned, I think part of that is how flowy this ink is. However, this is common with this nib. The upstrokes are drier, and I don't know if you'll be able to notice it on the video, but that gives, well, here in the loop-de-loop you can see just the slightest bit of line variation. Very nice, but on these tighter grids, I think I prefer the extra fine. Next, I'll be writing with my Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini. It has a 14 karat medium fine nib. I didn't have room to show it, but this Pro Gear Slim Mini writes more uniform in all directions. It doesn't have that dry upstroke, and it just feels nice and smooth. I'm getting a lot of ink flow. Both of these, very smooth. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Again, nice and flowy, very smooth, just like the previous two. I am going to go ahead and do the line tests. I don't know if it's visible on camera, but the upstroke is a little bit drier, but see how it just looks a little bit lighter? The other 3 directions are very dark. You can see it in the loop-de-loop. Instead of line variation, you're just seeing some subtle shading with this medium nib. Next, I've got a fully wind pen. I always get the number mixed up on this one. I think it's a 017. And I've replaced the stock fully wind nib with a Nemesign 0.6 stub nib. Let me try that again. Not very wet, but it's the line that it puts down is pretty nice looking and looks nice and saturated, and it didn't feel dry at all. It felt nice and smooth. That's interesting. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Very smooth, and it felt very wet as I was writing. Let me check the reverse writing here. The reverse writing was somewhat dry, but I guess kind of like the extra fine up here. It doesn't take much of this really saturated ink to put down a nice, legible, pleasant line. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. Very wet, and that just felt very velvety, very luxurious. Okay, while that dries, let's take a look at some of the other writing samples. On my 80 GSM Rhodia graph paper, everything felt fairly pleasant, maybe a little bit on the dry side, but not enough to make it feel unpleasant, and some of them were just borderline, felt a little dry. The Kaweco Broad had a pleasant chalkiness to it. And the Sailor Pro Gear Slim also had a chalky but very smooth, just a buttery chalkiness maybe. I don't know. I just remember it being very pleasant. The Custom 74, you can really see that line variation like there in the P, and see here that drier upstroke, and there in the loop-de-loop you can see the line variation. It was also very smooth and very pleasant. And even the Kakuno, that extra fine, felt very nice. There was some feedback because it's such a fine nib, but I wouldn't describe it as smooth, but it didn't feel dry at all. It was very pleasant. And you can see on the Rhodia paper I had just a little bit of trouble keeping the ink flowing on the paper when I did my tweezer swatch. I want to go ahead and show the little drip at the end of the swatch. Wanted to get kind of deep into the paper, but nothing else even came close to bleeding through the paper. However, on copy paper, and this is heavy copy paper, everything bled through a little bit. Now, the finer nibs only bled through a little bit, but on thinner copy paper you would see more of that bleeding through. And on the wider nibs, there was It felt smooth on the paper, but there was an unpleasantness from the ink just wanting to spread, like this where I wrote the name of the ink, that's the stub nib, and or the Akkerman is the 1.5 stub, and the Deepwater Blue was written with the Kaweco broad nib. Those two, I wasn't fond of them. The reverse writing on the Kaweco broad wasn't too bad, but I tend not to write very much with the reverse side of the nib. Now, one of my favorites was this Nemesign. You can get a broader line with that stub nib, but since it's not broad in every direction, it's putting down a little less ink, so it's not spreading as much. The Pro Gear Slim Mini was nice. The medium Pilot Custom Heritage 91 just felt a little too wet, kind of like the others. The ink wanted to spread. And even with the Custom 74, that fine nib, the downstrokes tended to be too wet in comparison to like the upstrokes, and even some of these side strokes just made the writing look blobby, and it felt like the ink was just coming out in blobs as I was writing, so it was less pleasant. And I find that a lot. The Pilot gold nibs in general tend to feel a little too wet on copy paper or highly absorbent paper. That depends a little bit on what ink you're using, but as a general rule, that tends to be the case. But the Pilot Kakuno, that extra fine nib, generally works really well on copy paper, and that's the case with this ink. There's a little bit of feedback, but it felt okay on this paper. The writing sample that I did with my 1.5 stub nib on Leuchtturm paper, again, just felt very pleasant. It's got a really rich look. I'm not seeing any sheen and not really any shading, but it looks almost like a matte finish, which kind of surprised me. I've seen some sheen on other writing samples, but I'm not really seeing any sheen here. It looks very matte and very velvety and rich. Now on my Tsubame ink collection card, especially down here, if I can hold it just right, you can see that sheen. It's almost, sometimes I think it's a copper color sheen, sometimes it's almost like a black sheen. My lighting's not the best. It's evening, so I don't have any daylight coming in, but I guess I'm not really seeing any sheen on the writing samples. It has to be a pretty heavy application of ink to see the sheen. Israel Zablau is my favorite Akkerman ink, and you can see it's much brighter. The Deepwater Blue looks almost black in comparison. The Atramentis Sherlock Holmes or Night Blue is another one of my favorite dark blues, and again, looks like a light blue in comparison to Deepwater Blue. In writing samples, Oxford Blue, Diamine Oxford Blue, can sometimes look indistinguishable from the Atramentis Sherlock Holmes, but you can see it tends to really pool up, and it has a little bit of sheen to it, and it can look, depending on how wet the nib is that you're writing with, it can be almost as dark as Deepwater Blue. Shinkai is a dark blue, but not as dark as Deepwater Blue. Tsukiyo looks fairly light compared to Deepwater Blue and looks more teal. Montegrappa Harry Potter Ravenclaw looks a bit lighter, and you get more shading, and it's got a bit more, just a touch more green in it. Noodler's Blue Black is very similar, but it's got just a touch more green in it also. Organic Studio Santiago Sea Blue is very similar, but it's got more of a red sheen. And so when you combine that red sheen with the dark blue, sometimes it can look a bit more purple. Roaring Klinger Verdigris is very similar, just a touch more green, I believe. And Sailor Mano Kick You is a similar blue if you're looking at just the lighter applications, but overall a much lighter, less saturated ink. I did a writing sample with all my pens on a small piece of rhodia paper and then submerged it in water for 10 minutes. I let it dry pretty much all day. I did this writing sample earlier this morning and then didn't submerge it in the water till this evening. And when I dipped it in the water, I could just see the ink exploding off the paper. Now, some of the nibs, you can still make out what it said, but I wouldn't describe this as having any water resistance. On the Tomoe River paper, I'm just barely seeing some sheen on this heavy drip at the end of the swatch. I'm not really seeing any sheen even on the heavier bits of writing with the glass dip nib. I am seeing a little bit of subtle shading. It's going to be hard to see in this poor lighting, but overall it's a very dark ink. A bit disappointing that it didn't have more water resistance, or this would be a nice work ink. The only place it got kind of deep into the paper was that drip at the end of the swatch, but it's a darker ink, so you're able to see it a bit through this thin Tomoe River paper. But it's a very pleasant ink to write with. Just a shame it didn't have more water resistance with it being a nice blue-black like this. But it just depends on how important water resistance is to you. If that's not an issue, this is a very nice ink. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.